Okay, so we're making some real progress in the color panel, but before we can move on and do any of the fun stuff like working on our images, what we have to be able to do is read our images accurately, because just going by a UI monitor or a gaming monitor or a monitor that is built into a laptop is not enough. When we work with color accurately, we need to be able to use what we call the scopes in order to make mathematically accurate readings of our images. So we're going to look at the scopes here. Now, if you don't see an interface like this, and by default Resolve's interface can be a little cluttered on small screens, it is designed for 2.5K monitors and up, then we can go up to Workspace here and we can choose Reset UI Layout and then just give that a left click. And that will make sure that we are all looking at the same thing. Please note that if you are on a laptop and you have a smaller monitor, you might only see the color wheels in the lower left to begin with. You might not see the curve and all these spikes in the center, but all of these tools are accessible, and we will go over how to find them later on. So the first thing we need to be able to do is that we need to be able to read contrast accurately. So we're going to go over what the Luma waveform is, how to access it, and then how to read it whilst looking at our image. Now, the next few lectures have a load of gradients in because they're the easiest way to demonstrate how these scopes work. So I want to expose my Luma waveform scope in the lower right of my screen. I have my keyframes interface exposed right now, which will be here by default, and there are 3 blurred diamonds here in the right hand side of the screen. Next to that is what looks like a little seismograph or a little zigzag on an XY axis. I give that a click and my scopes turn up. Now, the default scope is the parade scope, which we will cover in the next lecture, but it's a little bit more advanced than what we need right now. So where it says parade, I click, and from the drop-down menu, I simply choose waveform. And then I get a scope with a diagonal line going straight across now by default. This one can be difficult to read on a full color image. So next to the waveform and the drop-down menu, we have a little abacus icon here. And if I click this, I get access to all kinds of settings. I can choose to look at individual color channels. I can choose to look at horizontal and vertical chrominance. I can choose to look at all kinds of things. I'm going to hit Y here, which will give me the Luma waveform controls. The Luma waveform basically allows us to read or adjust the brightness or contrast of our image, and that is useful during the first steps of what we call the primary color grade, a grade that hits the entire image and carries out the first few steps of what we want to do. Now typically, Colorize, which we have at the top here, is a good option to have checked. If I want my waveform to be more visible, I can drag the waveform option to the right, and that will make my graph brighter, the white part of this graph down here brighter, or to the left, and eventually it will disappear. Generally speaking, about 2/3 of the way to the right is good, because it means that even the fainter parts of the reading are more easily visible. Graticule is the actual markings on the graph, the yellow horizontal lines and the 2 X and Y axes here. And if I drag Graticule to the left, I can make them disappear, I can increase their opacity. I usually drag these to about kind of only 1/4 up because I don't want them getting in the way of reading the scope's waveform. Now we're not going to deal with reference levels just for the time being, so do not worry about these. Now I can click outside of the window and it will close, and this scope is going to allow me to see the brightness information for the image I currently have in the viewer, which is currently a gradient, but I can also check a real image and you'll see the reading is very, very different. We're going to get to this in a few minutes, so back to the gradient for now. So this scope is allowing me to see the brightness information in this image, but how do we read this? We'll take a closer look at what it does. Now, don't worry too much about what I'm doing to the screen right now. If you want to know, Shift and F allows us to full screen the viewer like this, and I can right click and choose Show Scopes to bring up this hovering window with all kinds of information. Now I just want the one scope here. So in the upper right, I'm going to click the single frame icon. I'm going to make sure it's waveform. And for the sake of explaining this, what I want to do is I want to align it horizontally with the image. And this will become apparent why I'm doing this in just a second. But it's very useful for when we want to explain how all this works. So I've aligned my waveform and my scope so that they're on top of each other, and this is the easiest way to demonstrate exactly how the Luma waveform allows us to read the image. All of these scopes, well at least the two big ones, waveform and parade, give us a graph with two axes. We have the x-axis, and that is the x position, the horizontal position, of every single pixel in the image. And the y-axis is the brightness. The higher up, the brighter it is. The lower down, the darker it is. Now, the reason I teach using a grey gradient at first is that it illustrates the two axes almost perfectly. If I align the scope and the image like this, they immediately align horizontally. Everything on the left is on the left part of the graph or the scope. Everything on the right is on the right part of the graph or the scope. And what we see here is that I go from black on the left-hand side, which is 0, and the darkest colour we have, hence at the bottom of the graph, to white on the right-hand side. Then we get 1023, 1023, which is the brightest colour we can get in Resolve. It's pure white. So I'm going to move on to the next image just now. So here I wanted to really demonstrate the link between the X position on the image and on the graph. So here we've got 4 blocks where the gradient has been flipped. Notice now we have 4 diagonal lines because we have 4 instances of going from white all the way down to black, which is what creates this diagonal line. So as we can see, the 2 blocks in the center align with the 2 readings in the center, and the ones at the far left and right also align with the readings at the far left and right of the graph. And this is true of anything that moves, just like we saw before. You can see how the reading follows the block across the image. I'd like to make it absolutely clear that we only get X position on this graph, not Y. If this block were to move up or down, then the reading does not change because it is not moving horizontally. We get a slight little chatter because as pixels move, the values do change. And there's a very small little stalactite kind of, or stalagmite type reading in the lower left down here. That's just because of the border between black and white in an image which has been rasterized. That's more of an artifact of how this image was created as opposed to kind of something you really need to be careful about right now. So the only way that we can be sure of vertical position of a region that we're looking at in our image is to cross-reference the scope with the image. I can see about halfway across the image I have something very bright, and lo and behold I have the very top of the reading here and the left hand side of the gradient, which is very, very bright. So that's how we have to do this. This is basically how the Luma waveform works. It allows us to go through and check our images based on contrast alone, and it will give us the horizontal position of every pixel plotted against its brightness to give us a scope that we can read. Now I can just close this down here, and now if I go back to my standard interface it will reappear in the lower right. So we're going to move on to our real world example now, and it's worth pointing out before we go any further that if I make any adjustments to the image, then the scope will update in real time. We will get to our color grading controls in due time though, do not worry about that just now. Okay, so I have a task for you. I want you to go back to the short sequence that we conformed using the scene cut detector earlier on, and I want you to use this Luma waveform scope to read several shots throughout that sequence. In each case, what I want you to do is identify a bright part of the image and a dark part of the image. So as an example, I've got this shot up here, and I can see on the right hand side of my waveform I have a high reading. This is clipped out and a bit flattened. What I want to do is look at my image and go, okay, so on the very rightmost part of the image, I'm looking for the brightest thing, and it's the white paint on this graffiti sketch back here. Then I want to do the same thing for the darkest part of the image. I'll go, okay, down in the center, I have some quite dark readings. They appear quite low on the graph. It's probably the shadow in the dark parts of his eyes and in his mouth or under his chin, and they're reflected by the darker readings down here, just at the center. Now, as long as we have the colorize checkbox we covered earlier checked, we can see the colors on our Luma waveform, and this can make things a lot easier to read. For example, I can tell that I have some bright blue readings here, and sure enough, we have the kind of ocean blue colors in the graffiti in the background as well. If I click the abacus again and uncheck colorize, I just get a pure black and white image. Sometimes this can be easier to read, other times it's not. You can choose which one you want to use at any given point. Generally, in most images, colorize is more useful. So I want you to go ahead, go through 4 or 5 shots and read some important features. Look for the brightest thing, look for the darkest thing, and see if you can identify that on the waveform scope. Once you have done